Welcome to Foraging for Survival. This is going to be episode 2, forest food for feasting. Forest food for the feasting. Sounds good. In the first episode, I explained how if you ended up in a survival situation where you don't have the 4 essentials of survival, which is fire, water, shelter, food, in either order, the first thing you could do is look for a place to pitch tent. Then you could find water supplies. There's different ways of finding water, whether you're out in the woods or out or in a rural area or suburban or city. There's always places to get water. But in this case, you could go look for a lake or a river and other ways of getting water. So you've got your shelter in the tent, water if you need it, and fire if it's legal and if you can make a fire to keep warm or to cook with. But then what about food? If you're not completely self-sufficient and you know how to forage from your environment, you're going to go hungry unless you have a McDonald's next door and you got money. But for most people in a survival situation, they don't know how to forage off of what's around them. They haven't learned what is available as far as food goes. Now, first of all, in Central Florida, if I had to walk into these woods off of a highway and look for a place to pitch tent, find my lake over there as a water supply, and then start my survival situation, the first thing I would do is take this beautyberry plant. It's called beautyberry because there's going to be berries growing on these. This is also grapevines mixed in with this beautyberry. And I look for this plant. It's got these flowers. You want to get a close-up? It's got these flowers starting off. And these leaves are distinctive. They grow in patterns opposite. One is opposite the other. Opposite. If it was one and then one and then one, it would be alternate. But there's 2 leaves at each leaf node, which makes them opposite leaves. One opposite the other. And they don't have a bad smell. They smell fine. But they have an insect repellent, a natural insect repellent that will keep the mosquitoes from biting you by taking off leaves and rubbing it on your skin everywhere. I just grab leaves one after another. I even put them under my hat and I just start rubbing them all over my face, my hands, and I just get a bunch of it and just keep rubbing here and there, and the mosquitoes will not bite me now. It's called beautyberry, but the scientific name is Calicarpa americana. You can get up pretty high, or you can get some small ones, and they're hard to identify this time of year without the actual berries on them. But I'm going to show you a picture of the berries in a moment here. So that's what I start with before I go hiking. And I've been on long hikes in the swamp, in the deepest part of the cypress swamp in Central Florida, where the mosquitoes would just crowd around me. But because I rubbed those leaves on me, the mosquitoes would flutter around me and then without actually landing or biting. So they really worked, and it's been proven, and they're even using beautyberry, Calicarpa americana, in natural insect repellents now. They're using the chemical in there, and it smells fine. It doesn't cause any abrasions or itching, or there's no negative effect of using the leaves on your skin and on your clothing. I even sometimes grab some leaves and put them under my hat so that if I start sweating too much, I've got some to rub on me later if I can't find them. But they're all over Central Florida, deep in the woods, in disturbed ground, or in the oak hammock, cypress, sometimes in the cypress swamp areas, and in the pine scrub. You find a lot of these in the pine scrub. Now I'm going to move on to another plant called spiderwort. And this plant, oh, here's one. How's the look in there? Yeah. Now the flowers come out in the morning. We'll show you a picture of the flowers. They're really pretty. But this whole stalk is edible from the ground up. And what I do is I chop them up, and I can eat them raw in a salad. Not this thing. These right here, they're called spiderwort. They're kind of a spider. The reason they call them spiderwort is kind of they look a little, tops look a little like spiders when these flowers die off and turn to seed. The seeds fall off. I can chop them up, put them in a stew or a salad or soup, or cook them pretty much any way you want. And they taste fine like a green vegetable, and they keep their flavor and texture all year long. They don't turn rank, they don't turn bitter, and they're practically a year round. It's just one time of the year, maybe a few months during the summer, they might die off a little bit here and there, but you can still find one if you look hard enough. And then in the winter, they start popping up all over again in mass. They really like our cold temperatures here in the winter. But there's another interesting thing about spiderwort is the flowers. The flowers have, and I'll show you a picture of the flowers. The flowers have blue petals, 3 blue petals, and blue stamen hairs are in the middle of the flower. And those stamen hairs is what we call an indicator plant of gamma radiation. If there's ever a nuclear accident or nuclear fallout where gamma radiation exposure to an area has happened, you can look at your spiderwort flowers, and if the stamen hairs have turned from their blue, their bright blue, to pink, and I can't be 100% about this, but I've read enough information and researched enough information to believe that it's actually true, the stamen hairs will turn pink if they're exposed to gamma radiation. So it's an important plant in many aspects. Another aspect is the sap. The sap is a mucilaginous gel, kind of a sticky, mucilaginous, thick sap that can be used on cuts and scrapes and to cool the skin on burns. So you're looking at a medicinal, a gamma radiation indicator plant, and it's perfectly edible raw or cooked, and it doesn't turn bitter or rank during the year. It's one of the best survival plants in the southeastern United States. It covers from here to Texas, pretty much all the way up to the Appalachian and most of the southeastern states. You can find spiderwort, and in other places around the world, and other species of spiderwort. There's a red flowered spiderwort. It may not have exactly the same uses, but the blue flowered spiderwort is amazing. You just got to be careful. Like when I'm hiking in the woods, I like to wear long pants, even though a lot of hikers, you'll see them wearing shorts. I don't do that because I go off trail so much that, for one thing, I don't want to get bit in the I don't want to have to cover my legs with beautyberry leaves to keep the mosquitoes from biting when I just wear long pants. And there's briars, the smilax I showed you, the thorny briars. They call them cat briar, bull briar, green briar is another name for it, because they're thorny. And there's blackberries around here. There's blackberries further out down the trail this way. There's one spot where I found blueberries, and I turned around and there was blackberries. Tread softly is what the Indians called this. And the reason they did is because it can sting you like a bee. Except for the flower, everything from the bottom to the top, the stems, the leaves, they have little tiny hairs on them with a formic acid, a very strong formic acid that can sting you like a bee. It can hurt for about an hour and then fade away. It's not as bad as the actual stinging nettle, which some people call this, but it's not a stinging nettle. The Indians called this tread softly. In my book I call it spurge nettle, and they grow from here to Texas and throughout the southeast. I usually find them in very sandy areas like cow pastures, fields, very sandy fields, and we just happen to come across one out here in the woods. And I do find them in the woods occasionally. But this is called Snitoscolus stimulosus. That's the technical name for it. And stimulosus is a good variety to call it because it will sting you. It's very stimulating when they sting you. Now, there's nothing really edible from here that we can see. But what I do is I dig along the side of the plant. I'll take my shovel and dig here. And dig along the roots because I don't want to cut the root. I want to follow the root down about a foot, usually about a foot, to the tuber. And the tuber can be in anywhere between the size of my pinky to the size of a large carrot. And that tuber is very edible. I've had some that tasted like potato, others that tasted a little like parsnip, even others that tasted like a carrot. But it has a stringy core in the root that you don't eat. You eat around that, or you cook it first, and sometimes it takes a lot of cooking to get it soft enough to eat, but it becomes a very starchy vegetable, and there are millions of them. When you get to a cow pasture this time of year, you will see millions of them, and they grow little seed pods. There's not really any seed pods on this one, but the little seed pods, when they develop, will have seeds in them, and those seeds are even edible. But the seed pods will have the hairs all over them that will sting you like crazy. And that's Snitoscolus stimulosus. The Indians call them tread softly, for a good reason. This is called Smilax bonanox, or the common name for it is greenbrier, catbrier, and bullbrier. Now, the vines grow with thorns. There's thorns all up and down it, and they get some big vines. Now, these vines go way up into this tree, and you have these leaves. They have different kinds of leaves. They get a little rounder, but that's about as thin as they get. This is called the lobes. 2 lobes here. Well, 3 lobes if you count the extended one. And there's tendrils, 2 tendrils on each leaf. So in order to identify Smilax, you look for the thorns, a thorny vine with 2 tendrils on 1 leaf. And you'll find thorns all up and down 1 tendril, 2 leaves. I mean 1 leaf, 2 tendrils. It's like a mantra. You keep saying over and over, 1 leaf, 2 tendrils, 1 leaf, 2 tendrils. To remember, that's how you identify Smilax. And when you look for the shoot here is very tender, it's very edible, and what I do is I look for the weak spot and bend it, and if it doesn't bend easily, I go a little further down, and then it breaks easily. And I can eat that raw, or I can boil it like asparagus for a few minutes with a little butter and salt, and it tastes absolutely great. It's got its own flavor. Some people say it tastes like this or it tastes like that, but it really has its own unique flavor. And the best ones are these. They're called Smilax bonanox. I've seen them get twice the size, and then I've seen them that are very, very small. But the idea is they grow like crazy. They grow more in the spring here, but year-round, and you can find them from East Coast to West Coast in the United States, mostly in the southeast and the eastern part of the United States. Not so much you won't find them in the Rocky Mountains, maybe a few species out west, but there's 21 species of Smilax in the United States, and 12 of those species grow right here in Florida. And not all of them will have the growing tips. You'll find Smilax with similar looking leaves, and the thorns and everything will match up, but they'll be thinner. See, here's one here. That's a small one, but that's also the same species, exact same species. And I could cut that off and include that into my meal. I can eat it raw, on the move, on the run, walking, or I can cook it. And it's best to cook it. Put these in my pocket and eat them later. And the roots have been used as a sarsaparilla, as a beverage, and fermented, it becomes a beer. They used to make a beer out of the roots. but the roots are so hard and knobby and big, and they're hard to dig up, and they're absolutely hard as a rock. So it would take a lot of processing to make them into a flour and make them into a beverage, and then in order to make them into a beer, it has to be fermented. So as far as survival goes, you forget about the roots. Survival options are only one when it comes to smilax, and it's a wild green vegetable that tastes absolutely fine. Aquatic wild vegetables. This one is called pickerelweed. Now some books talk about the young leaves being edible cooked, but other books don't talk about that. So it would be a famine food. Like I said in the first episode, there are different kinds of foraging food. There's your choice edibles, like the smilax I just showed you and the spiderwort. Those are choice edibles. And then there's famine food, like pretty much these are, except for those seeds. This is I would go for a swim, but it's a very quick drop off, and I'm not prepared to go for that kind of swim. And there are gators in this lake, but they pretty much hang out on the other side of the lake. And there could be only one by now. There's been gators in here in the past. But anyway, this is called pickerelweed. Get a shot of this flower right here. It's called pickerelweed. There's two different kinds in Florida. There's a broadleaf kind and a lance-leafed. These are lance-leafed species, I think. And when those flowers turn to seed, the seeds can be pulled off and eaten raw. And it's got protein, fat, all the good stuff that you need in a survival situation. But those are seasonal, in which you got to wait for the seeds to form. The flowers fall off. That one might have some seeds on it, but I'm going to let it be for now. I'm going to wait and come back later and see if those seeds come off. If they come off easily in your hand, if you're rubbing the flower stalk after the flowers come off and you rub it in your hand, and if the seeds come off easily, then they're edible. They're ready to be consumed. And pickerelweed has young leaves coming down out of the base of the plant. They can be boiled as a famine food, boiled and eaten as an emergency. These are wild grapes. Now these species grow from here to Texas and throughout the southeast, but there are species of wild muscadines, like these muscadines, all over the country. But years ago there was a disease that killed most of the other kinds of grapes that grew in this part of the country, and the only thing left that was immune to the disease was the muscadines. So they started making hybrids of muscadines and natives, and these are probably male, because 95% of these wild muscadine grapes, wild grapes, see the shape of these wild ones have the same shaped leaves, but the shapes of the hybrid leaves will look more like a maple leaf than these. But you can see it has a serrated toothed edges. It's in the heart shape, the usual heart shape. And these tendrils are not forked, which means it's a wild grape. If these tendrils were forked, it would be a hybrid. But these are native muscadine grapes. And the problem, like I was saying, this is probably male and this is probably male, because 95% of wild grapes are male and they don't produce fruit. And it's kind of a hit or miss looking for the ones that produce fruit, and they don't produce fruit every year. The ones that will be starting to turn to fruit later in the summer, and then around September, October, probably September, I'll have some wild grapes to show you all over the place, and I'll show you a picture of the wild grapes right now. And another thing you can do with some grapes is the leaves are edible boiled, but not these. Normally it's the hybrids. They have the more delicate leaves. These are true fibers. I wouldn't use these as an emergency famine food. They're barely food almost. But in a pinch, if you needed to, you look for the wild grapes with the delicate leaves and you can boil those. But another thing with grapevines is the big thick ones. If you find some really big thick ones, they can be used to get water from them. They're a water vine. You cut up one high and one low, and it'll seep water from the ground and from out of the vine itself. Two different ways to get it. Or just cut it low and put a cup underneath it if it's dripping water, and you can collect water that way. But grapevines do make water vines if you find a thick enough one in an area where you've got some underground aquifers and you've got some moisture. And the grapes, the seeds have a teardrop shape to them. I'm looking forward to when they start starting to fruit. I know where they fruit here and there around town and out in the woods, and they turn to fruit in the same places every year, because you'll just have so many males that you won't be able to find the females unless you know where to find them every year in the same area. They pretty much produce fruit every year, and the fruit are delicious. You just got to spit out the seeds, because the seeds, the teardrop seeds, are not edible themselves. You know, swallow a few accidentally, that wouldn't be a big deal, because they're kind of small. And the berries, the grapes themselves are kind of small and black. They turn black and completely round. Saw palmetto. This is called saw palmetto, or scientific word for it is Serenoa repens. Repens is a word that means crawling, from the Latin for crawling, which is what they usually do. From the base, they'll crawl along the ground and then they'll start to turn upward. They can take centuries to grow. These are the oldest plants in Florida. And in dry conditions, they can grow very, very, very slowly. When they have more moisture around, in wetter conditions, they grow faster. But these are the seed pods that will be growing seeds in a few months. The seed stalks. They grow off of the heart of the palm. And if you were to cut this whole thing off, right about just underneath where the fronds come out, these are called fronds, the leaves are called fronds, and the reason they call it saw palmetto is that these fronds are very sharply toothed, like a saw. So that's why they call them saw palmetto. They're tiny teeth, but they're very sharp. They're like a saw. You can almost see a little shot of the teeth here. You can see the teeth on these suckers. That's why they call them saw palmetto. And what I could do in a survival situation is cut the whole thing just below the fronds and then cut it just above the ground and peel off the outer layers. It would take some work and you'd use little calories, but you would get some good carbohydrates out of the core. And they call the core heart of palm. Like a lot of palm species, you can eat the core. It has a almost celery, a cucumber type flavor to it. And there's different kinds of ways to harvest it. I could pull one up. Let's go over here. I'll pull one up for you and show you one of the ways that you can get a nibble out of it. Here's one right here. Oh, this is one of the ground nuts. There's different kinds of ground nuts. Now this is not the species of ground nut that has the milky substance that the Indians used. But if I dug this vine up, I could find some bulbous tubers, kind of round tubers in the ground. And this species, the tubers are very fibrous, but you can get a little starch out of it by cooking it and then chewing out the starch and then spitting out the fiber. The starch is very high in carbohydrates. But that's just another form of ground nut, not the best kind. The best kind is called Apios americana. This is probably something similar but different. But this is a young saw palmetto right here. And the reason I came over to this one is because I can pull up the center. I can pull up the center one here carefully, because like I said, these saw fronds, the fronds here are very sharp. So I grab the center and I just pull it up. This one came out easy. And that white section right there, you can just chew that right off. That whole white section is very tender, especially toward the end, the tip. This part here would probably be the best. And as you saw, I just pulled it up. I don't think that killed it, the plant. The plant would just grow another one. But there are millions of these things, and they're not protected. Even though they take so long to grow, there are literally millions of saw palmettos in Florida. I can pull up bigger ones, but this came out easily because it's a small one. The bigger ones are harder to pull out, and the even bigger ones are almost impossible to pull out. You can hurt yourself trying to pull those out. And if this was some other time, I'd show you how I can dig for grubs out of old wood, fallen down trees. And we got a lot of fallen down trees around here from Hurricane Irma. If I was looking for firewood, I could also look for food at the same time that I'm looking for firewood. And what I do in a situation like that, I have a tarp, a small tarp, about 6 foot by 6 foot, and with a rope tied to two ends. And I drag it along behind me and grab firewood and throw it on there. Now this is what saw palmetto looks like when it first comes out of the ground. You have the stalks growing, crawling. Like I said, they're called Serenova repens because repens is a word in Latin which means crawling. So they start crawling, and then they start pointing upward and grow upward. But you can have 1, 2, 3 or more coming from the same plant. These are all coming from the same plant. There's a big base right here, and like I said, they're old. There's some more here. There's some more here, so you can cut one and not kill the whole thing. I could harvest one of these, the heart of palm of one of these saw palmettos, and I wouldn't be killing the plant itself because it's connected to others that are all connected to the same spot, to the same root system. It's like a root system. That's saw palmetto. I use the fronds for a lot of things. I use the fronds for making shelter, for covering my campfire at night, covering my firewood. Now, I would use the bigger species called swamp cabbage. That's sable palm. And the other names for it, cabbage palm, swamp cabbage, sable palm, sable palmetto. I think sable palmetto is the other species. And the difference between the species is that this cabbage palm gets bigger, much bigger, and it grows on a trunk that goes straight up rather than crawling and then coming up. And with these, you have the sawtooth on the fronds, on the frond stems. With swamp cabbage, it's smooth. There's no saw on the, no teeth on the fronds. So you have some differences between the cabbage palm and the saw palmetto, but these are not protected and the cabbage palm are. They're actually the Florida tree. Florida tree is a swamp cabbage that you can also harvest the heart of the palm from the cabbage palm. That's how it got the name cabbage palm and swamp cabbage. But the problem is it takes so much work to peel off all the outer core of the swamp cabbage that you practically need a chainsaw to do it. Otherwise, the Indians didn't even bother trying to harvest, and Indians, I mean the natives from Florida, didn't even bother to try and harvest. They harvested these because it was fairly easy, but the cabbage palm is a much bigger plant, much harder trunk. As a matter of fact, so hard that they use the pilings, the trunks of the trees, for docks, pilings, for roads, for docks, especially for fishing docks. But it's very strong wood and very hard to penetrate. And the only reason that Indians started to harvest the swamp cabbage was when the Spanish explorers gave them axes, metal axes that they were able to use to harvest. But these they could harvest fairly easily with their stone knives, stone tools, and then once machetes came along, it was so much easier, at least for these. Just a note on the saw palmetto berries and other berries, the wildlife around here need to eat themselves. And there are certain times of the year when the only thing they have to eat is saw palmetto berries and other berries and roots and nuts and so forth. So whenever you're out, leave only footprints, unless you're in a survival situation, and then anything goes. As a matter of fact, in places that are protected, if you're in a real survival situation, and you can prove that and pretty much prove that in court, you can't be held responsible for damaging a protected species if you absolutely had to. But during most times of the year here, the wildlife have to use the wild food that is available also to us. So whenever you're out hiking, only leave footprints. Thank you. Wild blueberries in Florida. You don't find them very often. They're few and far between. And when you do, you find them in the spring rather than the fall, because they don't like our summers. I can relate to that. But these are actual blueberries. They taste like wild blueberries, and it's part of the reason I got into this field. Because when I was a kid and we lived in Massachusetts, I used to take walks in the woods, and to me I called it exploring. I didn't call it taking a hike, I called it exploring. And what I was looking for was wild blueberries. Then we moved back here again, even though I was born in Tampa. We lived in Mass on and off when I was a kid. And I had Suriname cherries, mulberries, blackberries, and that got me interested in foraging. Then when I became homeless and unemployed, I looked around and I said, okay, I can pitch tents, I can get water, I can keep warm. It's Florida. You don't have to worry about keeping warm, really. But then I said, what about food? Well, I already know how to find certain berries. Why not learn more about it and become completely self-sufficient? And by self-sufficient, I mean able to take care of yourself in a situation. You provide your shelter, provide your water, provide your warmth, and provide food. And the way to do that is to learn what is available. What kind of food can you find? You can find acorns. And these acorns around here are best if you get them in the fall when they're growing, and get them from the live oak. The live oak is the sweetest kind. There are two different families of oak trees. You've got the red oaks, you've got the white oaks. Florida has mostly the white oaks, and those are the better ones because they have to be almost all acorns have to be leached of tannic acid, which is a long process. But the less tannic acid you find, the less processing has to be done. So there is food in the wild if you know what to look for. And I love finding blueberries because it caused me to realize a full circle, going from picking blueberries as young as 4 years old. I remember picking blueberries in Massachusetts, and then over the past few months I've been finding blueberries for the first time in Florida, in the woods, deep in the woods. We're about a mile from the road here, and further down this trail, the Florida Trail, it's a little section of the Florida Trail, designated Florida Trail, where only hiking is allowed. There's no motor vehicles are allowed back here. It's a preserve. It's a Hillsborough Track Preserve, Hillsborough River Track Preserve, and it's my exploration place. place where I go to explore and look for wild food and learn about wild food that I study, write about, take photos, and pretty soon hopefully a book will be coming out on the subject. So this will wrap up this episode of Foraging for Survival. And next time we'll try a cypress swamp adventure, exploring. And there's other places around town. We're going to have all kinds of berries growing very soon now, because there are some fall berries that grow. And the blackberries are still around. I've been picking those a lot. We'll do this again next time. Thank you.